Hi, I'm Jim. I'm one of the volunteers on One Tail at a Time's behavior support team. This is Rona, and today we're going to be talking about leash reactivity. So first of all, we'll define what leash reactivity is, and then we'll go over some techniques that all fosters can use when walking their foster dogs, whether they are leash reactive or not. So if you have a foster dog that isn't leash reactive, we want to keep it that way. It's especially important in the environment we're in now with the stay-at-home order in effect and social distancing being observed. When we take our foster dogs out on walks, they're constantly seeing people and other dogs at a distance, but not getting an opportunity to interact with them. So that can lead to frustration, which can turn into reactivity. So we'll go over some techniques for how to prevent dogs that aren't reactive from becoming reactive. And then we'll also go over some techniques that you can use if you do have a foster dog that's leash reactive, how best to handle them on walks. So first of all, what is leash reactivity? It's when a dog is out on leash and it reacts to the sight of some trigger by lunging and pulling towards it and barking. So now I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So you can see in that example that the dog was lunging, pulling, and barking towards the site of a trigger. So what are some common triggers that cause leash reactivity? Usually it's other dogs and people. Also, objects with wheels on them like scooters, skateboards, and bikes can cause reactivity as well. So why are dogs reactive? It can be caused by a variety of factors. So first of all, dogs are constantly using subtle body language to communicate with one another. And when a dog is restrained by a harness and a leash, that inhibits their ability to communicate with other dogs. So that could lead to frustration and communication issues. Also, some dogs are very friendly with other dogs and people. They just want to go up and greet every dog and person that they see on the street. And when they're held back by a leash, that causes them to get really frustrated, and then that frustration turns into reactivity. Finally, some dogs are reactive because they are afraid or aggressive towards whatever their trigger is. So they might be really fearful when they see other dogs, and that causes them to react. So even to really experienced dog handlers, it can be difficult to figure out if a dog is reacting out of frustration or out of fear. So it's very important that when you're walking a leash reactive foster dog, that you never try to introduce them to another dog. Those introductions should only be done by the One Tail at a Time staff or behavior support team. So regardless of whether your foster dog is reactive or not, you want to set yourself up for success on any walk by, first of all, using the front clip harness that One Tail at a Time provides. That'll give you the best control over your dog, especially if a dog is reactive and starts pulling, it'll give you better control. And you also want to bring high value treats with you on any walk that you go on with any foster dog. So what are high value treats? It's some type of food that has a higher value to the dog than its typical kibble and the daily run-of-the-mill treats that they get for normal training activity. So for each dog, what's considered high value can be different. Just like people have different preferences in food, so do dogs. So it'll take some experimenting to figure out what's a really high value to your foster dog. Typically, string cheese and hot dogs are good options. You can cut those up into small pieces and bring those with you on walks. A lot of dogs also like lunch meat, liverwurst. So basically any stinky type of meat or cheese is a good way to start. So each dog has its own preferences in food, and it's also important to keep in mind that the environment that you're in affects how a dog is going to react to different food. So you might come up with a food that your dog really loves when it's inside, but that's in a controlled environment without a lot of distractions and stimulus. So once you go outside, a dog might stop reacting to a certain type of food because there are too many other sights and sounds around. So keep in mind that whenever you go outside, you really need to ramp up the value of that food to make sure that it'll get your dog's attention. So now that we've talked about how to set yourself up for a walk by using the right equipment and bringing high value treats, we'll head outside and give you some techniques for how to walk a dog that is not leash reactive.
So even though foster dogs shouldn't greet other dogs on walks anyway, social distancing guidelines will make it easier for dogs to get frustrated because they'll see other dogs and people at a distance and not get to interact with them. So we want to counteract that frustration by making a positive association between the sight of other dogs and people and giving them a high value treat as a reward. So in this example, you can see whenever Rona looked at another dog or person, Laura's given her a high value treat as a reward. So she'll make that positive association.
Now we'll talk about some techniques for walking dogs that are leash reactive. So for a leash reactive dog, the biggest reward that you can give it is distance. So when you're out walking a leash reactive dog, you always want to think about managing distance from triggers. Another concept you want to keep in mind is that each dog has its own threshold for triggers. So by threshold, I mean the point at which a dog will start to react. So for example, a dog that is reactive to other dogs might be able to see a dog at the distance of a block and not react to it. But then once they get maybe within half a block, that's when they start to react. So when the dog is under threshold, that means it's not reacting, it's not pulling, lunging, or barking. And at that point, the dog is able to take treats from you and be receptive to training. Once the dog gets over threshold and starts to react, it's not really going to be able to take treats or be receptive to training. So keep that in mind when you're outside walking a reactive dog. You always want to try to maintain distance from the triggers so that you can keep your dog under threshold where we'll be able to make progress with training. So now let's head outside and go over some techniques for walking leash reactive dogs.
So when you're walking a leash reactive dog, you first want to just avoid situations where you'll be around other dogs or people or whatever your dog's trigger is. So you want to walk in low traffic areas at off-peak times. So for example, right after work is not a great time to walk a reactive dog since a lot of people will be out walking their dogs as well. You can always walk down alleys if you want to avoid dogs and people in high traffic areas. So whenever you see a trigger, your goal should be to increase distance. So once you see something that'll trigger your dog, you never want to get any closer to it. You always want to increase your distance and always keep moving. What you don't want to do is make the dog stop, sit, or lay down. That'll make the problem worse. So when you do see a trigger, or when your dog looks at a trigger, you can reward it, similar to what we did with the non-reactive dogs. And then you can also use a high-value treat to lure your dog away. So right now, Laura will demonstrate doing a U-turn away from the dog in the distance. Another technique you can use is to cross the street if you see a trigger approaching. You can also use the cars that are parked in the street as a visual barrier. So if you try to cross the street and inadvertently run into another dog across the street, you can walk in the street next to the cars so that the cars obstruct the dog's view from the trigger.